Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Perlberg. I serve as Executive Director and Senior Counsel for ConsensusDocs. I'm speaking to you today from the Washington, D.C. area. I like to say I'm from Washington, D.C., and I'm here to help. But listen, thank you very much for taking time from your busy schedule today to attend today's webinar, Lean Contracting Practices Without an IPD Contract, and the new ConsensusDocs 305 Lean Construction Addendum. We have a great audience today, and we have great speakers with great content to match the great audience that we have. On today's webinar, we're going to provide you with an overview of the new ConsensusDocs 305 Lean Construction Addendum, why it was created, and how you can incorporate lean tools and processes in your contracts, even on projects that are not using an IPD agreement. During today's webinar, we're going to go over the fundamental lean tools that you can put into your contracts that will help you facilitate a lean culture on your next project rather than despite your contract. Now let me introduce today's fellow speakers. Let me start with Joe Cleves. Joe's a good friend of mine. He is a partner at Taft Law in Cincinnati, Ohio. He heads the firm's construction group. Joe is also the general counsel for the Lean Construction Institute as their outside general counsel. Joe has consulted on multi-million-dollar developments across the nation, and he's been able to successfully incorporate lean principles in his contracts, as well as negotiate several IPD agreements. We really wouldn't be here today without Joe because he's the one who took the bull by the horns and helped co-chair the update of our ConsensusDocs 300 integrated project delivery document and chaired the Lean Addendum document that we are going to go over today. Next, let me introduce Joel Darrington. Joel is contracting counsel for DPR Construction, a U.S.-based general contractor specializing in advanced technology, healthcare, life service sciences, corporate offices, higher education, and other technically challenging projects. Joel is active in the Lean Construction Institute as well, and he's written and presented numerous times on lean construction and IPD. He was a key contributor to the 2016 comprehensive update of the ConsensusDocs 300 IPD agreement. You know, and from my perspective, Joel's a key contributor to everything that I've interacted with him because he is really somebody who brings a lot to the table with really insightful ideas, and really he helps raise the level of everybody's effort because he's someone who makes reliable commitments and is just a pleasure to work with, and I'm really appreciative of all that he's added to our IPD and lean agreements. Last but not least, let me introduce Tom. Tom Rickert is principal of Lean Project Consulting Incorporated. Tom is a project and enterprise leadership information consultant, and he began his lean work in the 1990s. He's author of the book Lean Conversations. He will be leading a workshop at the upcoming October 2019 LCI Congress in Orlando that will be focusing on sustaining lean transformations. Tom is really somebody who helped us a great deal on the update of the Lean Addendum, or the creation of the Lean Addendum, with his practical expertise in lean coaching. So let's talk about today's webinar. We have 90 minutes for today, and you are encouraged to ask questions. You can do that by typing in the Q&A box, and we will get to your questions at the end of the formal presentations. So if you're thinking of something, put it in the box, or if you have an idea later, we'll be taking your questions, and be sure to type those in, and we will get to all of your questions today, either online or offline. The number one question, though, that we do get on every webinar that I do, I'm going to answer right now, and the answer is yes. Yes, you will get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and the recording. You've actually already received, hopefully, an email from me today with the PowerPoint presentation as well as a sample of the Lean Addendum. But don't worry, if you didn't get it, you can check your email box later, and you will get a recording of today's webinar, which hopefully will be very helpful to you and will help you listen in on what our speakers have to say. So before we get started, I just wanted to take a quick moment because today is an exciting day with ConsensusDocs. We're actually celebrating our 11 years ago today, we published and came into existence. as the ConsensusDocs Coalition. Our goal then, and remains now, to make the industry better by leading by example with best practice contracts. It was a first of its kind effort in the United States, and it made the cover of Engineering News Records magazine, E&R. Collectively, we represent over 300,000 stakeholders to the design and construction industry. What I'm really happy to report today is billions of dollars have been put in place successfully using ConsensusDocs contracts. And I'm also happy to report to date we haven't had any case litigation over a ConsensusDocs contract with all that project's success. Today, we have another industry first document which follows our track record of trying to provide solutions to you to help you address today's need. We released the Design Assist Addendum, which we're going to talk a little bit about at the end of the presentation and how it relates to the Lean Addendum. So hopefully after today's presentation, you'll take some time, if you're not already, to consider joining some of the over 3,000 subscribers that use ConsensusDocs contracts on projects successfully throughout the United States. And with that, I'm going to ask Joel to go over the ConsensusDocs Lean Addendum.
Well, hello, everybody. It's great to be with you. Right off the bat, people probably want to know, what is this ConsensusDocs 305? What's it all about? So let me be clear right up front. This is not a complete contract. There are no compensation terms. There's no schedule, no project scope. Instead, the CD305 is a document that you add to an owner contract to provide for certain selected Lean project features. So check out this graphic on the screen. You have a contract between the owner and the architect, and there's a separate contract between the owner and the constructor. The CD305 is meant to be an addendum to both of those contracts to transform them into contracts that will support Lean projects. Now, a quick note about nomenclature. The CD305, following standard ConsensusDocs terminology, refers to the lead designer as the design professional, capital D, capital P, and a general contractor or construction manager as the constructor, capital C. Now, I'm sure I'm going to slip up and say architect. I'm talking about the design professional, and contractor or GC when talking about the constructor, but just wanted you to be clear about what terms are actually used in the form. Advance the slide, please. So let me back up a little bit and talk about some different ways that parties typically have contracted for Lean projects in the past. To get the highest level of Lean performance, projects would use an integrated project delivery agreement of some type. Most IPD agreements, such as the ConsensusDocs 300, will explicitly provide for a robust set of Lean project delivery features. In fact, the CD305, what we're talking about today, the Lean Construction Addendum, intentionally borrows language from the CD300, the IPD agreement, with regard to the various Lean design and construction features that it includes. But for a variety of reasons, some project teams are not willing or able to use an IPD agreement. In those situations, some owners have worked with their legal counsel to custom draft design and construction contracts under more conventional project delivery models, such as CM at risk, so that those contracts will then include certain IPD-like features. These agreements typically will address most or all of the same Lean design and construction methodologies that IPD agreements will address, but without all the supportive contractual attributes of IPD. Other owners will settle with adding a few vague references to Lean in their standard contract forms, and then seek to promote Lean behaviors among the project team independent of what's in the design and construction contracts. But now we've got a new option for project teams that want a Lean project and yet cannot implement an IPD agreement. For the first time, we have a non-IPD contract document available to the whole industry that provides for a wide spectrum of Lean practices. With the CD305, owners no longer have to commission outside legal counsel or internal legal counsel to custom draft entirely new IPD-like design and construction contracts, nor do they need to settle for a few vague references to Lean construction added to their standard contracts. With the CD305, an owner can either use an industry form front-end agreement or its own standard contract, and then add to it a Lean construction addendum that reflects the best thinking in the industry around Lean design and construction practices. Advance the slide, please. While the CD305 works great with ConsensusDocs' own construction manager agreement form, it can be easily used with other contract forms and doesn't depend only on using ConsensusDocs forms for the front-end design and construction contracts. To be clear, the CD305 is something a project would add to both the design professional's contract with the owner and to the construction manager's or general contractor's contract with the owner. However, the CD305 is set up to only apply to situations where the owner is separately contracting with the architect and with the constructor. If you're in a design build contract, the CD305 is not well suited for that situation. But stay tuned. I know ConsensusDocs is exploring creating an alternative version of the Lean Construction Addendum meant for design build contracts. Next slide. So how is the CD305 different from an IPD agreement like the ConsensusDocs 300? Well, in IPD, the owner, architect, and construction manager all jointly sign a single contract with the key design consultants and trade contractors that put their profit at risk, also brought into that contract either as direct signatories or through special joining agreements. IPD is a whole different contractual model with unique features that include limited liability, joint project governance, and open book compensation, where only a service provider's profit is at risk for cost overruns. Like the CD305 though, IPD agreements typically will provide for a robust set of Lean project features. However, to repeat again, the CD305, the Lean Construction Addendum, is not a complete contract document. It is an addendum to the separate agreements with the owner, with the architect and the GC, and then passed through to the lower tier consulting and trade contracts. So if you look at the graphic on the right on the screen, the bidirectional arrows show the contracts for the project. The CD305 gets added to each of these contracts. The CD305 doesn't change anything about the compensation or liability of the parties under the contracts it gets attached to. Its exclusive focus is providing clear and definite terms for the parties to agree on how they will incorporate Lean design and construction methods into their project. Next slide. So why bother with using a Lean construction addendum when you can just stay silent in the contract and implement Lean on the ground? I think the best reason to address Lean design and construction methods in your contract gets to the very heart of why we use contracts at all. And getting together and figuring out what everyone is agreeing to and getting it in writing, the parties get better alignment about who is responsible for what and how they're going to do it. A team could get alignment in other ways, but the increased formality of putting it all in the contract will help everybody take it more seriously and make sure it's right. My former colleague Howard Ashcraft has wisely observed that negotiating the IPD agreement is the first collaborative act of the IPD team and sets the stage for future collaboration. We could say the same thing about a project team going through the CD305 together and everyone determining how they want to implement Lean on their project. If you use the CD305, you're also going to get some detailed state-of-the-art language establishing parameters for the project team's implementation of Lean project delivery. The project team can evaluate the language, check certain boxes, and adjust language as needed for their particular project, and thus get to a clear set of parameters for how they're going to implement Lean than if they were just simply to start from scratch trying to figure out these parameters among the team themselves. Another important consideration here, remember that the CD305 is meant to be used with conventional front-end design and construction contracts. In many instances, those front-end agreements will contain language that gets in the way of Lean project delivery. The language of the CD305 provides that it will override any conflicting language in the front-end agreements so that the teams can make sure that their implementation of Lean design and construction is not triggering problems later because of conflicting contract language. For example, the owner's standard construction contract could contain provisions around project scheduling that would interfere with a pool planning scheduling system that the team wants to implement. We're talking here about things like the last planner system. By using the CD305, the addendum allows for the pool planning system to be used without a breach of contract. Or for another example, the owner's front-end design and construction contracts are likely to provide for a traditional RFI process that's in conflict with the Lean process around RFIs that the team wants to implement. Again, the CD305 will override the traditional language in the front-end agreement so that the team's implementation of the Lean RFI process doesn't trigger a breach. Last of all, by having all the key team members contractually agreeing to perform Lean design and construction, the upstream contracting party can enforce these obligations against the team member that fails to perform them. But I want to emphasize, let's be careful here. The point of the CD305 is not to make the contract into a hammer to force team members to be Lean. It is meant rather to be a tool to help team members align about how they want to be Lean on their project. Next slide. Okay, so that covers when the CD305 is, what the CD305 is and why a project would want to use it. Now let's talk about when and how to use the CD305. When should a project use a CD305 with their contracts? And we're looking at this and considering whether to do this Lean construction addendum. We saw a real need out there for a way for project teams to contract for Lean project delivery when, for whatever reason, they're not going to be using an IPD agreement. So the CD 305 is meant to be used when you have an owner, architect, and contractor that are committed to implementing lean project delivery in some way, but one or more of them are not ready or able to enter into an IPD agreement. For example, the owner may have a strong interest in lean, but does not have institutional buy-in for integrated project delivery. Or the owner could have a source of financing that prevents the use of IPD. You could also have a public owner whose procurement laws or regulations will not allow for IPD. Or the owner could be fully on board with both lean and IPD, but a key project team member, such as the architect or general contractor, is not ready to commit to IPD, but is otherwise committed to using lean methodologies on the project. In any of these common situations, the CD 305 can help the team implement lean project delivery and improve the chances of success in their project. In terms of project chronology, we recommend finalizing the CD 305 as early in the project as the owner can accommodate. Certain lean project features are geared towards the beginning of the project and others towards the design phase. So a team can lose the benefit of those lean features by waiting until later in the project. Now that said, there's still value in implementing lean only during the construction phase. So if that's your situation, you can still use the CD 305 and be benefited. Now, how do you use the CD 305? Well, as I described previously, the CD 305 is an addendum to the contracts between the owner and each of the architect and constructor. Because it's attached to both agreements, it requires a joint negotiation between the owner, architect, and constructor, and ideally their key design consultants and trades. Once the CD 305 is finalized among the parties, then it gets separately attached and incorporated into each party's contract for the project, thus binding everyone to the same set of lean construction contract provisions. The CD 305 is designed to be flexible so that it can be adapted to a variety of project contexts and lean deployment. It uses a check-the-box approach to allow project teams to go through and select the lean features that they want to apply to their project and at the various points in the project chronology. So let's look at how this could play out in a few scenarios. Next slide. So to set the stage for this, I just want to show you a typical chronology of an IPD project. Again, the CD 305 is an IPD agreement, but many of its lean features mirror those in the CD 300 IPD form. The CD 305 can, depending on how you check the boxes, provide for lean activities in any or all of these different project phases. In a full implementation of IPD, the team starts with the validation phase, in which the owner presents the team with its allowable cost and its project program. The allowable cost is the maximum cost established by owner to meet its project program. If the owner's program can't be done for the allowable cost, then the owner won't do the project. So the validation phase is an effort by the IPD team to validate whether the project described in the owner's program can be designed and constructed within the allowable cost. If the team can't validate the owner's program and allowable cost, then the owner either adjusts the program or the allowable cost, or both, or the project terminates. Assuming the team is able to validate the program, then based on the outcome of their validation effort, the parties on the team agree on an expected cost, which is their best estimate of the project cost using current best practices. At the same time, the parties also agree on the target cost, which is the party's stretch goal for the final project cost and serves as the basis for target value design during the pre-construction phase. Both the expected cost and target cost are going to be documented in the approved validation study. So look at the graphic on the screen. You'll notice that these different cost benchmarks are plotted on a downward curve. This curve represents the project cost over the project chronology. The goal and typical outcome in IPD is that as the team learns more about the project and deploys the efficiencies and innovations that lean unlocks, then the cost goes down over time. Now, obviously, that's not inevitable, and it's certainly not a smooth curve as shown here on the screen. You'll notice that the expected cost and the target cost happen at the same time at the end of the validation phase. Both are determined at that point, but serve the different functions as I described earlier. The target cost could be set at the same dollar value as the expected cost, but typically it gets set lower in order to spur innovation among the project team. Once the validation study is approved, then the team moves into the pre-construction phase, where they design the project and plan for the construction. And while it doesn't have to be at the absolute end of the pre-construction phase, the team is typically going to commit to a contract price for the construction phase when the design is all or mostly complete. Then we move into construction. The team builds the project. And at the end, you have the actual cost, which is the total of how much the owner has paid the team for the project. To repeat, the CD 305 does not require that a team go through all these phases. Depending on your project's context, some or all of these phases may be addressed in your project's final CD 305. We accomplish this through a series of check-the-box provisions. Next slide. So in this first example, the owner desires a really robust lean implementation for the very beginning of the project. They do determine they don't need a joint site investigation because of the owner's previous extensive site due diligence. So they just don't check the box for the section 6.1 of the CD 305. However, they check the boxes for the remaining validation phase and pre-construction phase provisions so that the team will evaluate the owner's program, perform a validation study, provide for extensive cost modeling by the constructor throughout the project, engage in an integrated design process using target value design principles, and undergo a major risk identification and management effort, then move into the lean aspects of the construction phase. We're not going to spend much time now talking about these different lean features, but we do go into them in a little more detail later. Also, note that the CD 305 doesn't have a checkbox for construction phase activities. If a team is going to use a CD 305, then they're certainly going to use it for the construction phase, so that's just a given. Next slide. All right, in example 2 here, the owner is past the point of validation when it determines it wants to use lean project delivery. They bring on the architect and constructor from the beginning of the design to engage in an integrated design process using target value design, together with the continuous cost modeling of the constructor and the team's risk identification and management effort. Then they'll continue on to deploy the lean methods during the construction phase. So there's another way you can use the CD 305. All right, in example 3, the owner didn't even discover lean until the project was mostly designed. The architect is willing to participate in the lean project for the construction phase, and they choose a contractor that's selected for its lean expertise. They negotiate a CD 305 to incorporate into both the design and construction agreements. That's going to provide for an initial risk identification and management effort, that's section 6.6 of the pre-construction phase, and then proceed right into the construction phase's lean deployment. So each of these 3 examples shows a very different type of lean deployment, but each can be facilitated through using the CD 305 just by checking the appropriate boxes. Next slide. Those of you who know something about IPD are probably wondering, well, what about contract incentives that are tied to performance? Well, the short answer is that the CD 305 doesn't address incentives directly or do anything to change the way that compensation works under the front-end agreements. There's just too much variation in how project teams structure contract incentives tied to lean performance, if they use incentives at all. That doesn't lend itself very well to a standard industry approach in a form document. However, I will point out that the CD 305 does provide for the core group to establish what we call a performance improvement program. Joe Cleves will talk more about the core group later, but it's certainly possible for a project team to develop a performance improvement program that they could tie in some way to incentive compensation. So for example, the performance improvement program will establish key performance indicators used to gauge performance and stimulate continuous improvement. To incentivize improvement against these KPIs, the project team could enter into an amendment to their contracts that provides for owner-funded award fees that the project team earns based on how well they meet the KPIs. If a project team mutually agrees upon some system of incentive compensation, that's going to require that they address that through an amendment to their respective project contracts. Now I'm going to hand the ball off to Joe Cleves to discuss the lean project fundamentals that are articulated in the CD 305.
Well, thank you, Joel. So we'll start off with the fundamentals, the 5 big ideas. In spring 2004, Sutter Health held a conference for design and construction companies they had historically worked with. Lean Project Consulting facilitated the event and presented a manifesto to guide Sutter's future capital project. It was called 5 Big Ideas Reshaping the Design and Delivery of Capital Projects. These ideas inspired the first IPD agreement, which is a direct antecedent to the ConsensusDocs 300 and the ConsensusDocs 305, having been prepared by Will Lichtig. The 5 big ideas are expressed as 4 in the ConsensusDocs 305, the goal of increasing relatedness, in essence, building trust between, or being inherent in the stated 4. The addendum declares these principles to be the foundation on which the project team is organized and the design and construction processes based. The owner establishes the stated ideas as key objectives for the project team. Specific actions required to fulfill these objectives are set forth elsewhere in the addendum. And so the ideas, 5 big ideas: collaborate, really collaborate, optimize the whole, tightly couple learning with action, project as a network of commitments, and then increase relatedness or build trust. Next slide. A key insight of integrated project delivery and lean construction is that projects are a network of commitments. Examples can be found in the workers waiting to erect steel that is to be delivered on the 23rd of the month, or those who set up foundation forms once the hole has been dug on the 15th, or the drywall installers who follow the installers of ductwork who have promised to be finished on the 5th. Lean construction is based on relational as opposed to transactional contracting. Under this approach, the terms of the contract assume less prominence than the relationships themselves. Relational contracts, or in this case, relational addendum, establish mechanisms for delivery that focus on trust and partnership. Due to this focus, lean construction places a premium on reliability. The reliability of each player in meeting his or her commitments is crucial to the project. This was a key insight of Greg Howe and Glenn Ballard of the Lean Construction Institute, who developed the concept of pull planning. The most important element of a construction project's success is the handoffs that enable someone else to begin work. Like just-in-time delivery of materials, what is delivered in a project setting is work from one trade to another. In pull planning, which they have trademarked as the last planner system, they've created a system that values reliability over speed. Employing this system produces stable workflow, allowing the project team to explore other opportunities to eliminate waste from design and construction. This methodology stands in stark contrast to that of the push planning system favored under traditional contracts. Next. To quote the Lean Construction Institute, the essential work of projects is concluded as conversations and in keeping and making commitments. Thus, reliable promises from team members are fundamental to the success of lean construction. In order for a promise to be reliable, it must meet the following requirements. The conditions of satisfaction must be clear to the performer and the customer. The performer must be competent to perform the task or have access to the required competence. The performer has estimated what is required to perform the task, allocated adequate resources, and blocked the time on its schedule. The performer is sincere in making the promise, only making it if there is no current reason to believe it cannot be fulfilled. And the performer is prepared to accept the legal and reasonable consequences that may ensue if the promise cannot be performed, and will promptly advise the team if confidence is lost that a task can be performed as promised. It is safe to say that reliable promises are probably not core features of projects not employing lean. It is also important to note that Article 3 of the addendum expressly precludes joint liability and the inference of a fiduciary duty or partnership among team members. Next slide. So what drives the process? Well, that is the core group comprised of the owner, design professional, and constructor, or if only the construction phase, check the box is chosen, the owner and the constructor. This group provides daily leadership for the project, commencing with the initial selection of the team being comprised of the design consultants, the engineers, and the trade contractors. They define the project criteria in conjunction with the owner and in reliance on the owner's business case. They manage the budget and design process. Cost becomes a design criterion, and instant pricing feedback is provided. They implement the production control, namely the last planner system, resolve problems and conflicts, and oversee personnel and team members. Next slide. So the core group acts as the project executive, a role typically performed by the owner. And they do so in a setting where the fundamental premise is consensus. To get there, they need to be candid. They need to have a thick skin. They need to have an enthusiasm for change and improvement, and also a commitment to the goals and principles of IPD. In fact, an intellectual curiosity is helpful if not necessary. These second and third attributes play out when a crisis arises, which it inevitably does. And the usual tendency is to jump back in the foxholes and begin operating per tried and true methods of failure and waste. The reality is that it's the enthusiasm and commitment that the core group bring as leadership to this project that enables the team to ride through those crises and come out the other end committed and having achieved a level of success by staying committed to their principles. The core group needs the ability to decide and commit. There is no hierarchy. All three members are equal, or two members, and they have shared accountability and responsibility. We asked a core group member on a big project that was finished about 10 years ago in St. Louis, a hospital project, what happens if you don't agree? And his answer was, if we don't agree, that means we don't have the right answer. And we keep talking until we do agree. Next slide, please. So the consensus addendum provides for a performance improvement program. Let's be clear that the core group does not have any duties of supervision over or control of any person employed or retained on the project. All parties, consultants, subcontractors, and suppliers providing labor, services, material, or equipment to the project are independent contractors. Each team member is alone responsible for supervising its employees. However, the core group is responsible for developing and implementing programs for evaluating a project team's performance and its utilization of lean project delivery, and stimulating continuous improvement in the project team's performance. The performance improvement program will include at least the following elements: an established set of metrics, performance metrics to number no more than 15, a regular schedule for periodic evaluations. Course corrections are needed, and regular feedback is essential to maintaining progress. A focus on the behavior of team members, clear standards and protocols for evaluating performance against the established metrics, and a feedback mechanism on recommendations to improve team behavior. Now, with that, I would like to turn it over to Tom Richard, who will talk about team leadership and culture.
Thank you, Joe. Hello, everyone. I want to talk about culture because it's one of the most important things in terms of people engaging in the project. And the core group is responsible for developing and leading a positive team culture. Arguably, this is their most important responsibility, because if they don't do this well, the other lean practices easily fall apart. Leading the team culture can be understood to fall in about 4 areas of focus. First being team engagement, which requires aligning personal interests with the team and project goals. Second is a focus on making requests and commitments extremely clear. The third is internal team coaching. And fourth, rapid learning to support continuous improvement. And on the next slide, we'll first address this issue of aligning personal, team, and project goals. It's especially important in lean work to have people engaged in the project. Daily continuous improvement is rigorous, and it requires that people be and stay excited about what they're doing. This is the core group's responsibility to take the time that's necessary to understand how the people on the project identify personally and as a team with the purpose of the project. So there needs to be an alignment between individual identity and project purpose. And like these diagram shows, this alignment doesn't have to be perfect, but there has to be a general alignment so that people feel that what they are about as individuals is aligned and consistent with the purpose of the project, and that allows them to engage. The second area of responsibility is a focus on clarity of commitments that are being made. Projects are a network of commitments, and those commitments are made from performers on the project to customers. And Joe earlier gave you some examples of that in the construction phase. It's just as true for design professionals and also between design professionals and constructors. There are thousands or tens of thousands of commitments required to design and build a project, and a lack of clarity around any one of those commitments results in frustration, delay, and additional work. And it's the core group's responsibility to ensure that requests and commitments are very clear so that people understand what they're doing. On the next slide, we'll talk about coaching. And in this case, we're really talking about coaching on the project, within the project teams. So some teams may feel they need outside coaching, but whether they do or they don't, the most important aspect of coaching is how people on the team support their lean learning. And it happens daily. Everybody on the project should have at least one coaching relationship, and ideally more, in which they're either being coached in their effort to develop a skill, solve a problem, or tackle a challenge, or they're coaching others in their improvement efforts along the same lines. And a manager on a project, for example, may be coaching several people. This idea that we're always learning only works because we learn from each other and we help each other, and coaching is the avenue for doing that. And this last area of focus for the core group is on rapid learning. The coaching on the project is supporting this learning. In a lean context, we really are never satisfied with the current condition of our work. Even after making improvements to the work, some that might be radically superior to where we were before, we still need to be looking for our next challenge or our next improvement opportunity. And there's always going to be a gap between where we are today and where we want to be in the future. And that gap is a gap in knowledge. How do we get there? And that's where the learning comes in. And it requires that all of us on a project be very aggressive and rapid learners. So the core group is responsible for setting the tone and making sure that this learning happens every day. So the CD 305 wants to have us have a project planning system, and this project planning system is to help us with both the rapid learning and then also this issue about developing clarity around our commitments. When they say project planning system, what they're really meaning is something like the last planner system, and it's being used to plan, execute, and learn from the work. And the Addendum is clear about some of these practices, and then there are some practices that are implied. So while on the next slide, so the last planner system is a project planning system and is really the one that teams are using today. And it is a system, so it includes milestone planning, phase planning using a pull methodology, make-ready planning, weekly work planning, and at a minimum, percent plan complete feedback for purposes of learning how to improve the team's planning and the reliability of their commitments. And regardless whether you use the last planner or you're able to identify some functional equivalent, it's vitally important that all components of a planning system are used. This last planner system, for example, is not pick and choose. You don't do pull planning and leave alone the weekly planning. All elements of the system need to be used to be effective. Otherwise, your lean efforts do fall apart. It's important that you have a weekly planning cycle as part of your system, and you're very clear about what that planning cycle is. That's one of the core group's responsibilities, is develop this cycle. And aside from outlining what it is, you really need to publish it, post it like you post your other planning documents in locations where teams meet and people gather. This example on the screen is just a sample, and it's based on a weekly coordination meeting on Thursdays. Before that, there's preparation that's needed. This happens to show the weekly planning cycle for the construction team. the same type of planning system or cycle would be happening with design professionals as well. On the next slide, just addresses the issue of daily adjustments to the project. And this happens both in the construction phase and the design phase as well. Daily huddles, whether you're a design professional or a constructor, are extremely important part of the project planning system. They allow for the team to voice concerns based on what they learned that day, make adjustments needed to maintain the progress anticipated for the project. And these huddles also play an important role in maintaining the engagement of individuals with each other and the project. It's not just about a superintendent or a project manager knowing what's going on. It's about the entire team collaborating with each other. There are some implied practices. Percent plan complete, which is represented by that chart in the middle, is actually a specified practice. But what's implied by the CD 305 is that it is understood to be a part of the learning. It's tempting for people new to the last planner system to see percent plan complete as an accountability tool. It's not. It's a learning tool. It's feedback to help the core group and other members of the team understand how they can improve the reliability of the commitments that they make to each other. This use of a variance chart for classifying the reasons why you have plan failures is another device that helps the team understand where they should focus their learning efforts. And it's implied not only is there collaboration among the members of the core group, but the collaboration is team-wide. Everybody on the project is expected to collaborate, work together, and participate actively in all planning meetings. With that, I'll turn this over to Joel so he can continue discussing CD 305.
Hello again. So hopefully everybody recognizes this graphic from earlier. I'm going to talk about provisions 6.1 through 6.3 of the Lean Addendum, which describes certain validation phase activities and responsibilities. Again, these provisions only apply if the parties have checked the boxes electing each of them. So a project doesn't have to have a validation phase in order to use the CD 305, but it's certainly a good idea. Section 6.1 describes a joint worksite investigation that'll be performed by the project team. Now, while I've listed this under the pre-validation phase, it is certainly possible that a project team could choose not to check the boxes for the owner's program evaluation and the validation study provisions, so that there really isn't going to be a validation phase, but they still want to check the box for a joint worksite investigation. In that case, the joint worksite investigation would simply be part of the pre-construction phase activities. And that scenario also works just fine under the CD 305. If the team elects section 6.1, then the core group's going to evaluate what site information is needed based on a review of what the owner provides by way of site documentation and the team's own site observations. The core group will consult with the project team to come up with options for different levels of site investigations with cost-benefit analysis. Following the analysis, the core group will determine the level of job site investigations to be undertaken by the constructor and design professional. After the project team has made their joint worksite investigation, the core group will prepare a report of their findings and resulting recommendations for the project. So that's section 6.1 in a nutshell. Section 6.2 provides for the design professional and constructor to evaluate the owner's program to see if it needs further development. If the owner is still putting together its program, the 6.2 provides for the core group to assist the owner in further developing it. The project team will review the owner's program, confer with each other to confirm understanding and verify requirements. They'll then provide a joint preliminary evaluation of the owner's program, including any recommended changes, to the core group for approval. Section 6.2 provides for certain areas that the project team should consider in evaluating the program and allows the team to propose alternative systems to the core group to review that may better meet the owner's objectives. Now, if the owner wants a validation phase, then it needs to check the box for section 6.3, which provides for the real core validation effort. Once we have a confirmed owner's program, then the validation effort involves the design professional and constructor evaluating whether the owner's program can be completed within the allowable cost. Assuming the project team can validate that, then the validation study will include the proposed expected cost and proposed project schedule, along with a proposed target cost. If at any time it looks to the team like the expected cost is going to exceed the allowable cost, then the owner has a major decision to make. It could decide it needs the full owner's program and then could find a way to increase the budget so it'll increase the allowable cost. Or it could ask the project team to collaborate on proposed revisions to the program and to their validation efforts to that date that will allow the project team to propose an expected cost that can stay within the allowable cost. Or the owner could terminate the project as just having no viable business case for it. The final validation study is presented to the owner for its acceptance. If accepted, it will provide the parameters for the project team's pre-construction phase efforts. So I'm going to turn the time over to Joe Cleves to discuss the rest of Section 6 and the pre-construction phase.
Joe, make sure you unmute your phone if you haven't already.
Thank you. The pre-construction phase starts off with continuous cost modeling. The constructor is required by the addendum to provide cost modeling and analysis on a continuous basis. The constructor generates cost model reports at appropriate milestones as designated by the core group. Throughout the project, the constructor and any engaged subcontractors are to provide cost information and estimates of portions of the work, systems under consideration, and other cost information as required by the core group. As I mentioned earlier in the program, cost is a design criterion instead of an outcome as it is under traditional methodologies. The cost models should also contain contingencies and allowances as agreed upon by the core group. The core group must establish milestones for updating and reconciling the cost model to assure that the overall cost meets or is trending towards the owner's cost objective. If at any time a cost model exceeds the allowable cost or is trending away from the owner's cost objective, the core group must give direction on what actions shall be taken by the project team to bring the cost back into alignment with the goals. Next page or slide. So during the pre-con phase, to summarize, the constructor provides continuous cost modeling, analysis, and generates periodic reports. In the construction phase, the constructor and subs provide cost information and estimates requested by the core group, and the core group establishes milestones for updating the project cost model and directs actions if the cost model exceeds the allowable cost. Next slide. Target value design. One of the initial lean tools available for use is target value design. This is a disciplined management practice to be used throughout project definition, design, detailing, and construction to ensure that the facility meets the operational needs and values of the users, is delivered within the allowable budget, and promotes innovation throughout the process to increase value and eliminate waste in terms of time, money, and human effort. Target value design is a collaborative process in which the key participants develop an understanding of the owner's purpose and program. This stands in stark contrast to the traditional process in which the designers develop their plans and specifications in isolation. So throughout this process, we're looking for, among other things, ways to add value. We use pull-based design processes analogous to the last planner, but not identical, to drive innovation. Next slide. The parties develop a strategy for design implementation called the Target Value Design Plan. This is the mechanism by which key participants develop processes to establish the optimal design. First, the players establish initial target costs for major components and systems and identify ways of adding value. At this time, the parties create a cross-disciplinary team which monitors costs throughout the project. This target value team meets regularly to monitor the overall progression of the design. After the target value design plan is established, key participants finalize the target cost and scope of the work that must be driven along with within that cost. Next slide. Innovation and waste reduction become critical objectives at this point in the design process. The IPD team strives to reach these goals through intensified and coordinated collaboration. After the target cost is established, the team launches into project-specific design, and this process can be divided into 4 phases: planning, programming, design, detailing, and production planning. As part of this process, the team will develop milestones and pull plans. Brian, I'd like to go back to the prior slide for a second here. Pull-based design advances the design only so far as has been anticipated and approved by the IPD team. The designers only perform those services that are shown on the project plan as being performed in a given week. Alternatively, the designers can perform work that is identified as workable backlog. These are design elements that need to be completed at some point, but which are not part of the critical path in any design process. So the critical core idea of target value design is that the target cost, once established, can only be exceeded by express approval of the core group. And when a target for a particular component is exceeded and ratified by the project team, then the project team has to find another mechanism or source within the design that reduces the cost back, overall cost back to the allowed level. The underlying assumption of pull-based design is that it provides better value based on overall project needs. In this fashion, the designers avoid advancing design beyond what is needed and anticipated by the IPD team. It enhances the collaborative process in which key participants develop an understanding of the owner's purpose and program. Further, it allows the IPD team or the lean team, including its designers, to develop a common understanding of the owner's goals and values. It also allows for the analysis required to determine whether the facility can be constructed within the allotted budget and schedule. Most importantly, pull-based design establishes a workflow that allows key players to create innovation in the process. It allows the owner ample opportunity to adjust the scope and value of the project to achieve schedule and budget goals. This is achieved while providing better quality through timely feedback from key project players. Next slide. So cost analysis is not to be deferred. It's a byproduct of the continuing TVD process. We do address escalations in both the estimates, the expected cost, and the target cost. The expected cost and the target cost are adjusted at final completion to reflect the difference between the escalation allowance and the actual escalation. So this is just sort of a little bit of the nuts and bolts of the process. Next slide. Building information modeling is baked into the addendum, and please be aware it is not a software application. It is a process. It is a series of interconnected models and databases that combine in what's called a federated model that is integrated and can be manipulated for purposes of understanding the whole and the components. The federated model is comprised of all the different elements of design that are contributed by the various trade partners, engineers, and by the architectural team. Its lean purpose is to provide continuous, immediate, and reliable information regarding design, scope, schedule, and cost. Next slide. So another area where the lean addendum differs from traditional practice is in the conscious effort made in terms of risk assessment and management. So the process is articulated so that the team identifies material risks in early workshops. The core group selects a facilitator to lead the risk workshop. The core group may choose to employ an independent facilitator or use an employee of a project team member. The workshop participants identify material projects risk through a risk matrix mapping process, utilizing brainstorming, checklists, and other appropriate techniques. The facilitator records and prepares a risk excuse me, risk identification report based on the collective assessment of the risk workshop participants. They focus is on higher priority risks, those that are likely to occur and those whose time and cost impacts are material. The core group, at agreed upon intervals, updates the risk identification report in light of any other relevant additional data. So once the, can you go back there, please? So once the risks are ranked and identified based on a scoring mechanism, the team prepares a risk register identifying the principal project risks that need to be managed and assign a team member to lead the project team effort at monitoring and managing each risk. So the risk management plan that is developed identifies contingency plans for addressing identified risks, assigns primary responsibility to the management of specific tasks, and addresses the roles of others in managing those risks. With this, I'd like to turn it back over to Tom.
So Article 7 of the CD305 requires specific lean features be included during the construction phase. And while they're intended to address work during construction, design professionals will also want to pay attention to these practices, both with respect to their involvement during the construction phase, but also because these principles and these lean features are adaptable to design work with similar benefits. So the next slide, we'll talk about this first one, which is 5S. The 5S plan is designed and intended to help the team work in a more orderly fashion. And so the S's stand for sort, set in order, shine, standardize, and sustain. And sorting is keeping like materials, like tools together. Set in order is designating a specific location for materials, tools, and equipment, along with labeling of these locations so everybody has a clear understanding where items belong when they're not being used. Shine is keeping the work area clean. And standardize is having a current best way to execute the work on the project. And sustain is having practices in place that support maintaining the other 4 S's. And while it's probably easy to envision how these practices are applied to work in the field, 5S practices apply equally well to office work, to management work, including managing such things as electronic files. So this is an important practice that the team should adapt. On the next slide, you see that quality and standardized work and plan, do, check, act practices need to be included on the project. And quality applies not only to the finished product, the building itself, it also applies to all other aspects of our work. Standardized work is having a current best way to accomplish any task, and it's an important part of maintaining quality. Standardized work also serves as a platform for making improvements. So with the plan, do, check, act model for learning being the preferred approach to making quality improvements. And nearly everybody involved in Lean understands PDCA, but if this is one of your first introductions to PDCA, it is simply a model for understanding how we can learn from our work. But to do that, we need to have a plan, a clear plan that understands our expectations for the work. And then after the work, we need to evaluate it, check it, and see if we're getting the results that we expected. And learning from the work itself, and then making adjustments and acting to change how we would do this work again. Next slide addresses material flow. And material flow is a very important issue to address on sites. Right now, the prevalent practice on non-lean construction sites is getting as much material ordered and shipped on site as possible. And whether the reasoning behind that is to make sure all the material is available when needed, or to save shipping cost, or there's some other reason, all of those reasons are based on false logic. We know that tradespeople are most productive when they can focus on installing work and they're not distracted by searching for parts, moving materials around the building, or working around someone else's materials and equipment. The core group is responsible for developing a plan for managing material flow for both large components, but also for small parts. And so here you see a bad example of materials just scattered on the site, large materials in the way to the left. And on the right, you see a much better example of keeping parts and small materials organized and able to move around the job site very easily. Information flow is another important feature in a lean practice that needs to be addressed. The amount of information required to design and build a project is tremendous. So the core group also has to look at how they design information flow between all the parties. This includes who needs what information, how quickly information can flow from one party to another, what types of decisions have to be made. So RFIs, change conditions, constraints, submittals, those are a few examples of types of information that the core group needs to design information flows to address. So now Brian will come back on to wrap up.
Great. Thanks, Tom. So wanted to make a little pivot talking about, as mentioned before, that today is our 11th anniversary, and obviously I'm really proud and excited about that and what we've been able to accomplish. And so, some people celebrate with expensive gifts. We celebrated today with this webinar, as well as releasing a new Design Assist document. And I'm pretty excited about the new ConsensusDocs 541. And I particularly wanted to talk about it today because really, more than any document we've ever published, the Design Assist document and the Lean Addendum work together at a much higher level than we've ever done before. And the challenge with coming up with a Design Assist standard construction contract document was people said, well, what are you going to do here? Because there really isn't an industry standard definition of Design Assist. So how are you going to have a standard document to contract for it? So what we did is, one is essentially Design Assist is getting the early involvement of your build teams, your constructor, your specialty contractors, and get them to start talking earlier and more often in planning the design work and executing it, right? And what better way of doing that than using lean processes and tools? So in doing that, we basically try to create a laundry list, not a laundry list, but a range of services that you can contract for Design Assist. And some of them we have in most of them we have in a bucket where that is expected to use for Design Assist. And then we have others that are more optional. But when I said that the documents tie closely to one another, what we wanted to do is, rather than recreate the wheel of, okay, now this is how you do Design Assist, and this is how you do Lean, there's a lot of opportunities for overlap. But what we did is we made that optional. So what I mean by that is, in the document we published today, is you opt into the Lean Addendum for several things. And a lot of them we've talked about today, and I'm just going to highlight the ones that you have to check a box in the Design Assist document. And if you check the box, you have your choice of using the Lean Addendum provision that's applicable or using the alternative language that's in the Design Assist document. And those include using B.I.M, doing the owner's program evaluation, doing a value analysis, using lean principles for cost modeling. And then I told you that there were certain buckets that we have as the core Design Assist services, and then we have others that are optional. And of those optional services, we also make use of the Lean Addendum. One is for the risk analysis, and the other is for production planning. The other services that are part of Design Assist that are not in the Lean Addendum deal with constructability analysis, and a lot of it is with design coordination. And when I talk about those are some of the highlights. And again, that's really getting the design teams and the build teams to talk to one another. And probably the big thing that I haven't mentioned about the 541 is you'll notice that it's a different number, in the 500s. And the way ConsensusDocs orders our catalog of contract documents is by project delivery method. And the Lean Addendum could work for several project delivery methods, and we put it in the 300 series, and that's flexible. The Design Assist document we put in the CM at Risk series because we thought that that is where Design Assist is going to be most relevant. And when you're dealing with CM at Risk projects, some of the things that we thought would help with the Design Assist documents and getting the teams to talk earlier to one another is there's a host of other services that are not in the Lean Addendum. I'm not going to go in great detail of those today, but just for illustration, some things that are addressed are early procurement of materials and equipment, having manpower analysis, having contractors or your CM at Risk lead talk to you about creating design build packages for subcontractors and creating design build subcontractors, are just to name a few of the optional services and standard services that we have in the Design Assist document. And I just want to pull back for a second. Really, that is a highlighted risk that I hear a lot of complaints about these days, that both the Design Assist document and the Lean Addendum, I think, are going to help close the gaps on some of these, is louder and louder complaints that I hear time and time again about the quality and execution of design documents. And as an industry, if we're going to improve our productivity and efficiency, we really need to get better in those areas. And I'm really hoping that contractually we need to get better in addressing those areas. And hopefully the Lean Addendum and Lean processes and tools and using Design Assist in a CM at Risk environment will help close those gaps. So with that, I mentioned in the beginning that you are asked to ask questions because we want to get to your questions as a way of providing additional information. And I'm going to start with one of the questions that I got actually before the webinar that I'm going to ask my fellow speakers to chime in as they so desire. But what someone asked me is, okay, the Lean Addendum. I was at a Lean Coffee here in the Washington, D.C. area. I forget what that center of practice's official name is, but it's in the D.C. area. And the question I got in announcing the Lean Addendum is, okay, well, what are 3 priorities or 3 takeaways that you would wanted to highlight from the Lean Addendum that if I had to only focus on 5-minute elevator speech maybe, what would you highlight or prioritize as the benefits of incorporating some of these Lean Addendum principles into your contracts? So Joel or Joe or Tom, would you like to jump in on that question?
This is Joel. I guess I'll go first. So there's a part of me that wants to just resist and push back and say, why pick only 3? But I'll say if I had to pick 3, someone put a gun to my head, when you think about the contracts part of it and with the value add you get out of adding an addendum to your contract with contract language, to me, I'd think that the main things are having a validation phase, because that's novel, it's unique, it's not going to be facilitated by most contracts. The validation phase doesn't get you very far, though, if you don't actually move into the whole target value design effort in the pre-construction phase. So TVD is a very critical component. It's one of the best opportunities for reducing the cost of a project. It's by getting in that early constructor involvement, working collaboratively with the design team early on to help maximize the value of the project, to integrate the different perspectives to be able to get the best costing and value there. So that's a huge opportunity that gets missed if you don't build that in. And then when you get into the construction phase, that lean planning, full planning system is really important, critical, foundational. And that's also an area where if you don't have that in the contract, you can get crosswise of traditional contract language. So I'd pick those 3 if I had to pick 3.
Yeah, I would certainly think that having the core group specified and the whole concept of a core group being something that's part of the project is a very important part of it. And then understanding that the last planner system is much more than pull planning, because I think there is that mistake that's out there in the market. And that's a comprehensive system that also includes beyond milestone planning and pull planning. It includes the weekly discipline of make ready planning and work planning, and then the learning that has to happen to become even better at the system. And then the third thing I would say is that it makes clear that Lean is not just the last planner system. There are other practices that a project needs to include.
The only thing I would add to the excellent points you guys have made is just I highly value the risk identification and management process as being a truly unique tool that the Lean Addendum offers that goes to the heart of the actual management of the jobs. I mean, and gets the team away from the reacting to a crisis by just asserting blame and throwing people and resources at something to get it solved, and allows for a very timely and intelligent application of assets to the process to continue eliminating waste.
So I just want to remind everybody, if you have additional questions, please type those into your Q&A box. I have a question here for Joe. You mentioned that one of the core group's roles is to resolve disputes. Does that override the main contract's dispute resolution clause?
It actually works hand in hand with the main contract dispute resolution clause. I mean, it overrides it to the point that the initial dispute resolution comes through the core group. And in fact, in 4.4.2 of the addendum, it says that dispute resolution under the terms of the contract documents shall be deferred during the pendency of the core group's efforts to resolve the dispute and may only commence in the event of an impasse. So if the core group can't figure it out, okay, the document says, yeah, we'll let you revert to type and go back to the terms of the master agreements. But otherwise, we want you to play by the rules here and use best efforts to resolve it by consensus.
Yeah, I'll just add that in the ConsensusDocs agreements, one of the things we have in our dispute resolution is that we make sure that we call it dispute mitigation and resolution, because the best dispute resolution is to mitigate the dispute before it becomes a problem. And what you just said really highlights how that works hand in glove. So here's a question for Joel. If a project team checked all the boxes in the Lean Construction Addendum, would that essentially transform their contract into an IPD agreement?
That's pretty easy. The answer is no. IPD requires a whole lot of other contractual features that the Lean Construction Addendum doesn't address. To have what most people would consider an IPD contract in its fullest sense, you need to have some type of limitation or waiver, limitation of liability or waiver of claims. You need to have a whole different system of compensation that aligns risk and reward. Some of the other features that are in the Lean Addendum, that you checked all of them, that would help get you closer to an IPD agreement, but it wouldn't get you all the way there.
Great, thank you. Here's a question from Anne. She says, what are the specific sections of the addendum that you would want to make sure that you flow down into or verbatim into the general contractor subcontract agreement?
Yeah, there's no specific sections that are intended to be referenced in isolation in the subcontract. The entire addendum is intended and required to be incorporated by reference into both the GC subcontract and the architect's subconsulting agreements on the project.
So a way of illustrating that here is this slide maybe is essentially, we're going to put those Lean addendums in if in the case of ConsensusDocs, your 750 or 751 subcontract is an attachment to that. Now, one thing I did find,
there's actually there's a better graphic if you go down a few slides.
This one or
there. the one on the right. So you can see that CD 305 gets attached to all those different contracts going down the chain.
Yes, good point. Thank you, Joel. And then I actually also failed to mention the structure of the Design Assist Addendum is also similar in that it specifically says in the title that it's an addendum to both, at least initially, the owner design professional agreement and the owner CM at risk builder agreements. And then yes, also you should attach it to your subcontracts as well. Okay, another question. Tom, you talked about the 5 S's. Will the project team be in breach of a contract if they don't organize the field equipment and materials as effectively as shown on your slide?
Well, if the core group developed a 5S plan that required that materials or small tools be handled that same way, and I think you're a few away from it, maybe 1 or 2 more. There you go. So you're talking about the slide on the right. Yeah, so if the core group specified in their 5S plan that that quality or that level of organization is part of the plan, then yes, you're in breach of the agreement. Now, I would say and suggest that there are bigger problems than a breach of a contract agreement at that point. If the core group is developing a 5S plan and other lean practices that the team has agreed to take care of and address and include in their work, and the team is failing to do that, then there's a leadership failure that's happening. And that's even more important than the breach of the agreement. So yeah, yes, you are in breach if that's because you're required to implement the 5S plan. But again, this is really a leadership issue more than a contractual issue.
Yeah, Brian, I might put a finer point on the answer there, which is that, you know, the CD 305 requires you to have a 5S plan. So if you refuse to do the plan, then yeah, I guess you could be held in breach. I don't know that I've seen many 5S plans that are going to be so specific that it's going to require the actual picture on the right to be the accomplishment of that. So my sense is that it's going to be a little bit more general principles that you need to follow rather than specifically on this floor, you're going to organize the things in rolling chests this way. So I guess it's possible, but the more likely problem is that people won't do a 5S plan or won't follow it after you've been asked to put that in place. Again, to emphasize Tom's point, you've got other problems that you're going to need to resolve. So this is probably a symptom of a bigger set of issues you need to address.
Gotcha. Our industry is very focused on the bottom line, and so this question goes to the heart of that. Are there any metrics that define the potential savings available with the addition of each of the 3 phases that are included as part of the addendum to add as lean tools? And maybe if I put one of these slides up here, it might help. Well, maybe not, but I wanted to have that graphic. Yeah, so it's one of these graphics. Any thoughts on the metrics of defining the potential savings here when adding all of them?
I'm not aware of any comprehensive study that identifies metrics by layer of lean implementation. The only in-depth study of it was done on IPD by Renee Chang up at the University of Minnesota Architectural School in conjunction with LCI, and they looked at 10 IPD projects and concluded that based on a whole number of criteria that they achieved the promise of IPD, but they didn't break down metrics or break it down according to metrics, and I'm not aware of anybody else who has, although I think it would be a very valuable teaching tool if we were ever able to develop that information.
Yeah, from time to time, I'll get trade contractors talk about what they're seeing and what they're observing in terms of the amount of time they're saving. when they implement lean practices. And it's not only the last planner, but also in terms of material flow management. And at times you hear numbers around 20% productivity gains. None of that's documented in what I would call a rigorous study, but that seems to be a fairly common point. I think I think that's valuable to be saving that kind of money. I think the other important part is that a lot of teams report work is just more enjoyable because the collaboration creates a spirit where people are working together, and that time savings is due to the fact that they're working together to remove a lot of the frustrating issues that get in the way of working on projects. They're handling material better. They're identifying where people will be working. They're creating a stable workflow, so there's predictability in terms of what's going to happen on the project day to day. So yeah, there's a financial gain. There's also just an enjoyment comes back to work when teams are working this way.
Yeah, and I actually think that aspect is a real unheralded element of the success of these projects. The people in the field, whether it's in the design tables or on the actual construction site, view themselves as professionals. They take pride in their work, and they are typically and continually frustrated by processes that degrade their input and minimize their effectiveness. And so pretty uniformly, when you expose them to a system that sort of liberates them from those constraints, you get some joy. And people who are in that modality are going to perform better, just by human nature. And so that, I think, is a very strong component in the success of the overall project. The players in the field really are not motivated by incentives. I think, Joel, you've published on that. So the founders of Lean and IPD, the group that sort of, masterminded all this, have hit upon a very compelling formula for success, I believe.
Their construction projects are really dangerous too. And so one of the interesting findings that Glenn Ballard has been reporting is the impact of deploying Lean on construction projects on improving the safety of the project. And so he's got some research that talks about the impact on safety as well.
Great. I have a question from Alejandro. Is there any clause in any of the documents that mentions how to handle change of scope to the sub if the company defaults? And is there a way to give that scope of work to another sub in the Lean strategy?
I mean, default is not typically addressed, but the process wouldn't look too different from what normally occurs, in that there is a default option under the constructor or subcontractor agreement that would be exercised, and one or more replacements will be brought into place under the terms of the original scope that obviously still needs to be completed, and thus the later entrance to the project would fall under the same Lean scheme. So I think that's the best way to look at it.
Just to be clear, the CD 305 itself doesn't address that, but it would be how you address it under the contracts to which it gets attached.
Right. Another question here, which is relevant to the graphic that I kept up, is what does the owner miss out if they don't opt into the validation phase? And what about possibly if they miss out if they don't opt into the pre-construction phase is also part of the question.
Part of it is that they lose, I mean, in addition to the benefits engendered by the specific steps, the elements that allow the elimination of waste of those phases, there's an intangible in terms of the gelling of the team and the momentum that the team derives from the continued successes that they would experience early in the project. So I suspect that the teams that start off this process in the validation phase are going to have a healthier culture and be more successful at each step throughout the process than would be typical for teams that just begin in the construction phase.
I guess I just reiterate what I said in my top 3 answer, which is that you get a lot of opportunity to improve the value of the project by having the team go through the validation and pre-construction phase to get well-grounded and go through that target value design effort. That's where a lot of the value can come.
Oops. Good. I've got one last question. And before I go to that question, I want to make actually a quick reminder. I probably should have made this in the beginning, is for those of you who are seeking credit as part of your AGCCM lien credential, you will get information afterwards that will validate that you were on the webinar for the entire time and get a certificate for your participation. It's a new feature, and I think this is one of the first webinars that has gotten acknowledged as credit, and that was information we emailed out. So there's a new system, and you will be able to validate your attendance on this webinar for the entire time. And with that, I'm going to ask one last question and then thank our speakers. I'm hearing a lot about TAKT. What is that about, and what are the benefits? Is there something inherent in the lien process, or is it something new?
So that's referring to talk time, and in a conventional lien sense, that's aligning the flow of production work to the customer demands or the demands of the market. So the way it's commonly being used on some construction projects, and I'm sure some people are using it in slightly different ways, but the idea is how can we create a stable flow of work through a building? For example, taking, let's make a simple example, a multifamily building where each trade in, say, the rough-in and finishes phase is going through and doing 2 units per day. So you're having, the painter do their prime coat of painting in those 2 units, and then the second day moving on to the next one, and perhaps say the flooring contractor's coming in behind them and they're doing their work in 2 units in a day and then moving on, and so on. And so everybody in that parade of trades is moving at the same pace. They've sized their crews to do that. And if you can align that work tightly so that they're closely moving one behind the other, you can very quickly move through a project and complete it. To include something like that in the document, it may not be a tactic for planning that's appropriate to all projects. If you have a project with very different spaces, it may be difficult to have a tack time as the approach. There may be other issues specific to the composition of the project team. I also think that in the industry, there are some people that might describe it somewhat different than I have, so that one label may mean something different to other people. And without some consensus on what the approach even means, it'd be difficult to start specifying something like that in a contract document.
We have actually I got another question that I think we have enough time to tackle on that before closing out. Is it the intent to use both the CD 305 and the ConsensusDocs Design Assisted document together? Joel, do you want to tackle that one? Yeah,
it's not the intent that they have to be used together, but it's certainly a possibility we designed into the document. So one way you could fill out the Design Assisted Addendum would be to check the boxes to apply certain provisions from the project separately in Construction Addendum when you're filling out that DA Addendum. But if the project doesn't have a lien addendum, they can still use the Design Assisted Addendum. They just would be checking different boxes. So you can use them together, but you don't have to.
Thank you. Thank you. Hey, to Joel, Joe, and Tom, thank you so much for your leadership and participation on working on the ConsensusDocs working groups and creating those. Thank you all for attending. You will be getting an email. I should also mention you will have an opportunity to get other samples of documents like the ConsensusDocs 300, which is a full-on IPD agreement. and other documents as part of the follow-up for this presentation. You just need to go onto our website. But again, thank you. I hope you found today's webinar informative. I hope you use the Lean Addendum and other ConsensusDocs documents to help our industry get better project results. I'm Brian Perlberg, and with that, thank you very much and have a wonderful rest of your day and a great weekend.